Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Cadence Independent Media production. Today we are talking about something that I have been really looking forward to for a while. I call it, many people call it, mixing from the drum throne. We're going to talk about making a balanced sound, especially for recording, but really for all the time. One of the best compliments that I've ever gotten on a recording session was an engineer friend of mine telling the producer that he doesn't normally put a microphone on the hi-hat when he's recording drum sets, but when I'm playing, he always mics the hi-hat. That feels like sort of an odd conversation to overhear, but what it really means is that my approach to the kit is one where I'm thinking about where bleed is going to happen and just like how loud each item on this kind of tiny orchestra that we're conducting is going to be in the microphones. This applies to live situations as well, but I mean, it's pretty dramatic in the studio. If you've ever thought about the collective sound that you're making, there are characteristics about every item on the kit that can kind of crash into each other or can overwhelm each other. And these are issues that we have to think of if we want to figure out how to make a really cohesive sound, whether it's live or in the recording studio. I want to take a moment to really thank effusively our Patreon supporters for keeping the channel alive right now, keeping the season going. We're in season 3 now. We're having a blast with this stuff, and we are also deep in pre-production for some exclusive content and side series, cymbal series for the Patreon, basically to say thanks to the people that are making it possible for us to continue to do this. If you're interested in involving yourself in that, the link is below in the description of this video. Please go check it out, see if you can help out at the very least, tell your friends, and let's just keep it going because we're really excited to keep bringing you this content. A moment of technical information about the playing and what you're going to hear today. You are going to be hearing just the AKG C414 behind my head, and there's a reason for this. We are talking about mixing in real time. We're talking about setting levels and being intelligent about each of these instruments and how they throw the sound. One of the dangers of playing the drum set acoustically is hearing it here and imagining that what I hear here is going to be the same that's in the microphones or the same that's for your band or your audience, which it never ever is. So we're going with minimal miking to help really demonstrate the differentials between these playing examples and the acoustic differentials in the parts of the kit as far as it goes to like getting to a microphone or getting to an audience member. Now you may also notice that the close mics here are present. We are going to do some mixes and some examples for the Patreon that will illustrate how these thought processes can get into your mixes and influence how easy your drums are to mix and how easy it is for you to get the sound that you're imagining when you're playing. First off, I'm going to play a little bit in my sort of normal manner, keeping in mind the idea that I have to balance things. I want to make sure that everything is reaching this one microphone in a manner where nothing's jumping out too loud and where it sort of sounds like it's been balanced in a mix. Now, lots of great drum recordings have been made with a single microphone, and in my experience, people who cut drums that way professionally or who are proficient at it, they think about these things. There are other levels to this, like with minimal miking, where muffling is your friend, possibly playing at a slightly lower dynamic so that you can use compression later to sort of build up the sound of the kit, can also be a thing. But for today, we're just thinking in terms of acoustic levels and thinking in terms of frequency ranges. Now, before we get into some other examples, my experience in terms of recording drums, playing drums live, and literally looking at transients like in Pro Tools, it basically goes like this. Cymbals are metal, and they make a lot of high frequencies. Even dark cymbals make kind of a lot of high frequencies. High frequencies want to go in all of the microphones, the condenser mics particularly, but other offenders can be the ride cymbal into the floor tom mic, the hi-hat into the snare mic. And what ends up happening is that you get a limitation set on what you can do with those close mics. If you're just using overheads or a room mic, then it becomes differently complicated. But at the end of the day, it starts with the cymbals and figuring out how to keep them out of everything. I've seen people put them very high so that they don't bleed into the tom mics. There's famous stories about Dave Grohl playing drums on Queens of the Stone Age with no cymbals on the kit and then overdubbing the cymbals afterward. I think he used like V-drum pads so that they'd have MIDI to know when he hit which cymbal. And these are the sorts of things that are just about being able to get a good drum sound. And it's perfectly reasonable. Like if you're really wailing and it's super high energy, that is going to be a component, just a fact of it. I've seen people put cardboard around the snare mic. I've seen a lot of tape on cymbals. I've done tape on cymbals. Some of these things become mandatory. Sometimes you have to do them. And there are no wrong choices here. But if you can start with a balanced sound, that means that you will have less fussing around to do and you'll get to your job faster. All right, first, and tongue-in-cheek a little bit, I want to demonstrate my experience teaching sometimes kids or people who maybe have played by themselves a lot or just haven't had any kind of input about this particular phenomenon of like understanding which parts of the kit are intrinsically loud and which parts of the kit don't travel so well. Briefly, we'll take it apart, but basically, hitting cymbals hard is fun because they're super loud, and also 9 times out of 10, people have to be told that rim shots on the snare drum are going to be louder and more present than just hitting the drum aggressively in the center or even medium in the center. However hard you're hitting the snare, especially if it's rim shots, you have to elevate the toms a little bit. And then the kick is kind of off in its own world because it's pointed on a different axis than the rest of the kit. So a lot of variables. But suffice to say that without any mixing or outside input on a recording that sounds like that, it's basically all cymbals and it sounds pretty messy and there's not a whole lot you can do. Now let's get a little more specific because that was kind of like an amalgam of things. Let's talk about just playing aggressively. I'm going to just kind of play very hard, but I'm going to make sure that I'm not backing off on the cymbal the way that I probably normally would if I was trying to get this sort of sound in a single microphone. Even if we were using the close mics, there's going to be an awful lot of this in the floor tom mic. It's going to be in the snare mic. It's going to be dominating the overheads. If you relieve the intensity on the cymbals just a bit, or choose thinner, smaller, quieter cymbals, if you like the sensation of playing like that, then it'll give you the opportunity to open up the overheads and the room mics a little bit more and get a bigger sound out of the drums themselves, because they're going to get left behind if all you've got is cymbals in those. This is also an issue in live situations, whether it's an in-ear monitor situation or just any kind of stage where the band is near to you. These kinds of high frequencies can make it difficult for people to hear the high frequency parts of their instruments. And I've had many, many, many experiences where I felt like I was in like an arms race with the guitar amp, where I was washing out the high end because I was having fun, and they turned their amp up, and I was like, okay, cool, we're off to the races, and I start playing harder, and then he's turning it up more, again, putting it in the monitor, and then by this time, the bass player and the keyboard player and the singers are wrecked. They can't hear anything because all they're getting is this high-end battle between me and the guitar amp, when a more pragmatic thing to do would be to figure out a ceiling that I'm going to play at, and if he's got to go past that, like this is kind of sound check stuff, but if he's got to go past that, I need to not go with him because you don't want to be stepping it up that way. And it may also be that like my mix is off and maybe he's actually not getting enough guitar. All that to say that there's really only one frequency spectrum on stage and you need to make sure that you don't dominate any of them so that everybody can play well. Really getting into the hi-hat. This one, there's two parts to this. We'll play and then we'll talk about it. Now, I love the sound of the shank of the stick on the hi-hat. It sounds awesome. I like it especially kind of mixed in with tip stuff on top, but there's a lot of options there. It's a really great sound. It is 3 inches from the snare mic, and that means that if I want this mic to be usable, I have to be careful both about how hard I'm playing the hi-hat and also how softly I'm playing the snare drum. So if you're really digging into the hi-hat and you're kind of mediuming the snare drum, you're turning this into a hi-hat mic, which you may or may not already have there. But any articulation you're hoping to have from ghost notes in this mic, they're just going to turn it off, or they're going to have to compress it and do weird band EQs and notching and all kinds of stuff to just be able to use the snare sound. And since there's so much hi-hat there and the snare is happening less often, it becomes the dominant voice in that microphone. As a side note, from my perspective, and this is an opinion thing, but I feel like it's a fairly common opinion, the parts of the kit that are playing 8th notes or 16th notes are keeping time, but often the kick and the snare are the thing that are really kind of like influencing the arc of the groove. And the hi-hat and the ride, they can do that too for sure, but if you're playing in a way where the only thing that anybody's hearing is the hi-hat or the ride cymbal and you want them to be hearing the snare and the kick or maybe the toms, these are situations where you have to look at like, do I need to be digging in that hard on the cymbal? Maybe I should be hitting the snare harder. Maybe I should be playing rim shots, or maybe I should be playing with the tip of the stick, or just a lower height. You know, I'm a big believer in the Dave Garibaldi thing of height as dynamics. There are other people who espouse this as well, but that was where I learned it, was from Future Sounds. And getting into the idea that it's not about how hard you're hitting, it's about how high you're hitting, and not trying to strike hard from low or strike soft from high. Game changer for me, and I definitely recommend checking that out if you can. All right, third, and I'm going to say most common as a spectator that I've seen. We live in New York. Lots of clubs in New York are on the smaller side, have lovely backline kits that have no mics on them at all. And even in the ones where things are close mic'd, I've seen this phenomenon so much that I have to talk about it. And it's the idea of someone sounding good, playing grooves, sounding good, playing fills on the snare, and then when they go to the toms, it all goes away and it becomes super duper quiet, and then they smash the cymbal at the end and go back to the groove. And oftentimes they're playing really outrageous stuff on the toms, like crazy chops, and it looks like it sounds amazing, but I'm not hearing any of it. Even though there's mics on them, sometimes there's not, but even if there is. And my personal opinion is twofold on this. One is that people tend to tune their toms in such a way that lower dynamics don't jump out as much as the snare does, because we're just talking about tension on a head. We've talked about that a ton. Another thing is that I think that, and maybe this is the big thing, the volume you're experiencing at the kit from the toms may sound the same as the snare and the bass drum and maybe the cymbals, but that low stuff, especially if it's tuned really low, is not making it past the front of the stage. It's just not. This is just physics. It's the nature of low end. It's the nature of the way people experience sound acoustically. And what this means to me is that, getting back to that hierarchy when we were talking about cymbals, toms are on the bottom of the totem pole. So if you're thinking about a balanced sound and you're smashing the cymbals and you're really smashing the snare, you have to go further than that on the toms. Doubly so if you're using thicker heads or hydraulics or something. They're going to feel amazing. There's going to be all this fatness right where you are, and the dude right there, maybe the guys on stage, are not going to receive it. So when I'm thinking about stuff like this, especially at unmiked gigs, I want the audience to get a balanced sound. And that may feel balanced where I am, it may not, but I am acutely aware of this. And I think that especially people coming up who are just getting a sense of dynamics around the kit beyond playing the vocabulary that they know, could really benefit from concerning themselves with where these things live in the hierarchy of the volume. Now, the snare is in the center. Playing in the center without the rim can be very loud. Rim shots can be very, very loud. Similarly with the bass drum, burying the beater is going to carry further than not burying the beater, but it's also going to have less low end than if you don't. So there are all kinds of choices that you have to make when you're generating, again, like this ensemble working together. If I was a conductor and there was a person on each of these, I would be telling them what dynamic fit with the collective sound of the ensemble, but it's just me. So that means also that, if you're playing a really dark sounding snare and you're playing in a really loud band, you're going to have a hard time. And conversely, if you're playing straight ahead and you brought the bell brass, you're going to have a differently hard time. If you have a superphonic, you're probably always going to be fine. That's just the facts. Now, as a sidebar, something that both of us here have experienced was coming up, playing along to records in headphones. And in my case, earbuds with shooting covers over them because I wanted to really hear the music and play along. That really takes a lot of your sense of your own dynamics out of things, and you can feel amazing when you're rocking out, but it doesn't really translate all the way, and you don't realize that the floor tom and the snare are not even close to throwing the same amount of sound. Similarly, if you play by yourself all the time and you don't have to compete with frequency ranges from other instruments, that's going to throw you off on stage or in band practice situations or recording situations in particular, because there will be parts of your sound that you're suddenly not hearing because there's other stuff there. The bass is going to be in your bass drum, the guitar is going to be in your snare and your cymbals. Who knows? It could be anything. And so the prescription for this is to record yourself. And you do not have to have fancy recording gear. You can do this with your phone. And I encourage you to do it with as simple of a device as possible, because we want to have a single point of sound recording. We don't want to have a bunch of mics. We don't want to have a bunch of angles. We don't want to have anything that we can mix afterward. We want to just hear a raw recording and do it, listen to it, and figure out how to make that sound awesome just with your playing. If you listen to it and you're like, dude, that is all hi-hat, the solution is to play the hi-hat softer or play everything else louder. Similarly, move it around. If you're in a spot where you're like, man, the kick sounds super duper loud right there. It might be where the phone is. It might be how you're playing it. All of these things are going to inform the sound that you're making from the audience's perspective. So in the end, we want to be able to be enjoying what we're doing, and we also want to be able to express what we mean to express and generate the feeling and the energy and the music that we're trying to make. So there's a balancing act there. It can't always be bashing all the time. It can't always be babying things all the time. But the balance, that's the big trick. It can be crazy loud. It can be super duper soft, but just balanced. That about wraps it up. Don't really need to compare any of those. But suffice to say that we are in charge of a percussion ensemble, and we should be thinking about the members of our team working together to make the best collective sound that we can, and experiment with that as much as it takes to be happy with what you're doing and make sure that you're making the overall sound that you're looking for. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you hear about our new videos for Season 3 that are still coming out, 12:30 p.m. every Tuesday, Eastern Standard Time. We are extra excited for some new series that will be on the Patreon, so jump over there and check it out if you can. I would really like to know your perspectives on the idea of mixing yourself from where you're sitting, because every style of music is a little bit different where this is concerned. And also depending on the venues that you play, it could be a different kind of situation. If you are primarily drumming for video online, that's another thing. So let us know your experiences, and I'll look forward to that.